Well, good morning, sunshines. Let me tell you, it is 8:25 and it has already been a morning here. Currently, my kids are jumping up and down on my couch, and all the cushions are on the floor. Um, I am on my second pot of coffee, and I just found a goldfish in my hair. So, just living the dream. All right, today I'm going to take you through the home front in the United States during World War One. It's important to keep in mind that the United States did not get actively involved in the war until the very end. However, honey, there's no kids. I'm recording the video, but you can still come say hi. Come here. You can't see anybody, and there's no video, but say hi. Hi. Say have a good day. Good day. Yeah. Can you blow a kiss? Oh, there you go. There's a kiss, guys. All right, go play sissy. Anyway, but there were still things going on prior to our actual declaration of war because many people, especially the top, knew that that's the direction it was headed. So let's go ahead and get started. I will try to keep it under 15 minutes for you. Home front during World War One. So one thing that World War One did produce in the United States was a lot of great military music. And you may have heard the song, over there, spread the word, something, something over there. Okay, that's probably one of the most famous ones. If I was in class, I'd probably dance to it for you as well, but that's all you're getting today. Selective Service Act. So the Selective Service Act is just another name for the draft, okay? Hold on. So a lot of times as we're living through life, everything that we're living through seems controversial. And then in retrospect, it often, hold on again. Anyway, controversies. In history, they don't seem controversial, but the draft was incredibly controversial. So they weren't able to get enough men, and so they institute the Selective Service Act. And as a result, 24 million men registered for the draft by the end of 1918. 4.8 million men served in World War I, and about 2 million saw active combat. For the record, the draft still exists today. All 18-year-old males have to register for the draft. And I do think that either in the next 10 years, we will see the draft sidelined again, or women will be included in that as well. That's just a thought. 400,000 African Americans served in segregated units. And 15,000 Native Americans served as scouts, messengers, and snipers in non-segregated units. In World War II, we'll talk about the Navajo code breakers. Native Americans played a significant role in most of our wars. All right, so opportunities for African Americans during World War I. So at the same time that World War I was going on, there was a massive movement of African Americans from the South to the North, which we'll talk about at great length during the 1920s. In particular, it's referred to as the Great Migration, and they are leaving Southern rural areas and towns, going north looking for jobs, opportunities, and largely to escape the Jim Crow laws and the violence of the Klan in the South. Okay, so about 70,000 African Americans migrated within this time period alone, and because the factories are prepping for war, there's going to be a lot of factory jobs available. Many African Americans will enlist. Of course, they will enlist in segregated units. That is thanks to Woodrow Wilson's Lily White policy. Labor. So the War Industries Board told factories what to produce, and the War Labor Board settled labor disputes. So whenever you're in a large-scale war, the government often gets involved in what your factory is doing and what your factory is producing, which is exactly what happens here. You may have heard both President Trump and President Biden reference COVID as a wartime presidency because both President Trump and President Biden have used the Defense Act to tell companies, hey, we need you to produce XYZ for the COVID crisis. And at the same time, during wars, the government would tell companies, we need you to produce XYZ for the war, of course. Women were also working in larger munitions factories. They were called canaries because the TNT that they worked with turned their skin yellow. Around 400 women actually died from overexposure to TNT during World War I. Other hazards were more obvious. and minor problems were common. Uh, Great film on Netflix as well, The Radium Girls. Um, Also a reference to women's work and their work during World War One that would later go on to kill them, but we'll talk about that later. The role of women in World War One. So women in the military, they did serve. The Army had a nursing corps of about 10,000 overseas, and the Navy had a number of clerical duties and radio operators. I think it's worth mentioning that I believe I was in college when the military finally expanded frontline operations to women. So that's relatively recent. Not that they weren't serving on front lines prior to that, but it became official. All right, so the war effort at home. So we've got the War Industries Board headed up by a guy that you don't know or need to know. His name's Bernard Bush. Food Administration, Herbert Hoover. Hoover will later go on to be president. It's notable that this is the only role that he had in government prior to being elected president, and he would be president during the beginning of the Great Depression. Fuel Administration, Railroad Administration, the National War Labor Board. So whenever there were problems about pay or hours, they were the ones who solved disputes because, the country couldn't have people going on strike in the middle of a war. All right, so let's talk about the Food Administration. So during the war, both World War One and World War Two, there was this major push for people to take, responsibility. And the next few slides, you're going to see a lot of propaganda. So the Food Administration would call for things like wheatless Mondays, meatless Tuesdays, porkless Thursdays to try to conserve food to send to troops, okay? Um, and while they're pushing this conservation, I want you to think of this as the equivalent for today would be the commercials trying to get people to wear masks or people, encouraging people to social distance. You may have seen that Ohio commercial with the ping pong ball and the mouse traps. Like that is the modern day equivalent of these posters. Save wheat, use more corn, meat, use more fish and beans. Again, these posters were everywhere in grocery stores, in schools, constantly trying to get a message out to the public because, of course, they didn't have Facebook or TikTok or Twitter or, commercials. There was also rationing. Rationing is when you are limited as to how much you can actually get. So, imagine a world where you're told, hey, you can only buy this much gas a month. Here's your card. Once you're out, you're out. Or you can only buy this much sugar per month. Once you're out, you're out. And this helped conserve food as well. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about propaganda posters in both the Great Depression and World War II, but these are some excellent examples, and you can see that they're playing on a lot of emotions here, especially with these images. And we'll talk more about the strategies they use later. There was a push to raise victory gardens, raising your own garden, so that you did not have to rely on grocery stores as frequently, so they could conserve food. Even towns would raise victory gardens together. Fuel Administration, how to help Uncle Sam win the war. Fire small amounts of coal often, keep fuel even, save gasoline, don't spill any, permit leaks used for washing, okay? Stop the leaks and save the drips. They're trying to save fuel for the military. Keep in mind, again, we're just involved at the very end. If you think this is, asking a lot of people, World War II is much, much larger scale, much longer. Liberty bonds and victory bonds. This was asking people to invest in the war. So the way a bond works is, let's say you buy a $50 bond. And all it is you give essentially the government $50. They give you a bond or piece of paper that says in so many years, when this bond reaches maturity, it'll be worth maybe $75. You basically get your money back plus interest over a period of time. And this was a way that they helped fund the war. My daddy bought me a government bond on the Third Liberty Loan. Did yours? I mean, how can you argue with that face? Okay. And this was a way that the everyday public, the literal public was giving the government money. They were giving them loans, essentially. Committee on Public Information for Minutemen. So these are men who would go about to different governmental areas, town halls, and give speeches talking about the war and trying to drum up public support. Now, this is where things get a bit more dicey. How far are you willing to go for your country? So I mentioned the difference between patriotism and nationalism the other day. And during war, every country has a tendency to get a bit grabby with your rights. So let's talk about the Espionage Act. So the Espionage is just a fancy word for spy. Okay, it was passed in 1917. And it forbade any actions that obstructed the recruitment or efforts to promote insubordination in the military. Now, keep in mind that when the draft was issued, it really split public opinion. Only about half of people were supportive of the war effort. Okay, again, 100 years later, historically, we act like it was, whole hog, but there was a lot of people who were against it. It ordered the Postmaster General to remove any leftist materials from the mail. So anyone who pushed against the war effort, or anyone who suggested that it was a restriction on rights, like the draft, for example, all of that was ordered removed from the mail, and you could get fines up to 10,000, and so on. So most judges in a non-war time would call this a restriction of civil liberties, freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. But the government and the courts have ruled multiple times that they can curtail your rights during times of war in the interest of the country. And it really is driven home right here with the Sedition Act. So Sedition Act to me is the bigger of the two. And we'll talk more about these in the 1920s because these don't go away with the war. The Sedition Act made it a crime to speak against the purchase of war bonds or willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, or abusive language about this form of U.S. government, the U.S. Constitution, or the U.S. Armed Forces, or to willingly urge, incite, or advocate any curtailment of production of things necessary or essential to the prosecution of wars, yada, yada, yada. All right, so what does it mean? Basically, it makes it illegal to make any open criticism of the government or the war. So, like, no joke, you could get thrown in jail for saying, like, I don't think this war is a good idea. I don't think that we should have soldiers fighting over there. It just doesn't seem like it's democratic. Okay, like, you could say that, and if it was in public, you could be tossed in jail. And the courts ruled that it was perfectly legal because your opinion, because it goes against the war effort, it could possibly hinder the draft or the support for the war effort and therefore lead us to lose. This idea towards being critical of war will change over time, specifically in the 60s and 70s when we see the protest against the Vietnam War, and we'll talk about that later in the year. But this is just an example in history where people ask themselves, what do we value more? Our freedoms or our safety? And in this case, the government is ruling on the side of safety and saying, hey, you're going to have to give up these freedoms to criticize if you want to ensure that we win the war and live to fight another day. So it's a good question for us all to ask all the time. Where do we, what do we value most? Do we value our freedoms and abilities to do things more? Or do we value our safety of the collective more? And that's an actual question that I want you to think about. So that is it for the day. I want you to watch this, get a jump start on your short answer test, open notes for World War I. It is posted, and that's it, folks. I'll be posting the daily later. Hope you're having a great day. Bye.